I never imagined my marriage would end this way. For 12 years, I had been married to Amelia, my college sweetheart. She was radiant, smart, and up until recently, I thought she was completely devoted to me. We shared everything: dreams, ambitions, even a passion for travel and exploration. That's why it blindsided me when things began to change. A little over a year ago, we had both started new jobs. I worked for a financial firm that kept me busy from morning to night, while Amelia joined a consulting company that required her to travel often. I wasn't thrilled about the travel, but I trusted her completely. Then came him, Marcus. Marcus was a business associate she met at a conference in San Francisco. It started out innocent enough, or at least that's what I thought. I remember Amelia mentioning him in passing, saying he was a good listener and that they had bonded over shared stories from their careers. I didn't think anything of it. After all, Amelia was outgoing and made friends easily. But gradually, her mentions of him became more frequent. It was always Marcus this and Marcus that. I even joked that Marcus was her new work husband. She'd laugh it off and brush my comments away, calling me ridiculous. But there was something in her laughter, a nervousness I'd never noticed before. About 6 months after they met, Amelia's work schedule started to intensify. She was away more often, with trips lasting longer, sometimes stretching an entire week. She insisted the work was demanding, the deadlines tight, and I wanted to be supportive. She'd leave, and I'd handle things at home, believing that our sacrifices would eventually pay off for both of us. Then, one evening, I found something strange. Amelia had left her laptop open on the kitchen table. A notification popped up on her screen from Marcus. The message read, "Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again." My stomach dropped. Every bone in my body screamed to read more, but I was afraid. Afraid of what I'd find, but I couldn't ignore it. So, I opened the messages. They went back months, full of late-night confessions, deep talks, and intimacy. My hands shook as I scrolled. They had inside jokes, pet names, even shared memories of places I'd never been told about. All this time, she had been seeing him behind my back, slipping into a secret life I never knew existed. In the middle of it all, I found a message from Marcus. Should we tell him? And Amelia's response, "Not yet. He doesn't need to know. Not yet." They had decided to let me live in ignorance. I barely slept that night. The words on the screen seared into my mind, running through my head on a painful loop. Part of me wanted to scream, but a stronger part wanted to stay composed, to plan my next steps carefully. Amelia was scheduled to return from her business trip the next evening. So, I decided to prepare. When she walked through the door that night, she wore a casual, relaxed smile, as if nothing had changed. She set her bags down, came over to kiss me, but I pulled away, avoiding her touch. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging as I struggled to mask the anger and betrayal swirling inside me. "What's wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowing, surprised by my coldness. I took a breath, keeping my voice steady. "We need to talk." A flicker of something, fear, guilt, crossed her face, but she masked it quickly. "Sure, let's sit down," she said, her voice just a little too calm. We settled on the couch, and for a moment the silence between us was suffocating. Finally, I couldn't hold back. "I know about you and Marcus," I said, looking directly into her eyes. The words came out cold and sharp, like they'd been waiting for their release. Amelia's face went pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came. For once, she looked vulnerable, caught off guard, stripped of the smooth lies she'd been feeding me for months. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She stared down at her hands, fiddling with her wedding ring. It wasn't supposed to happen," she stammered. "I never wanted to hurt you." "That's not an answer," I replied, clenching my fists to keep from shaking. "How long?" She took a shaky breath, finally meeting my eyes. "Almost a year." My heart twisted at her words. Nearly an entire year. That meant every holiday, every anniversary, every quiet evening we'd shared in that time had been tainted by her betrayal. I felt my composure slipping. Why? I demanded, my voice breaking. She looked away, a tear slipping down her cheek. I never meant for it to go this far. It started with simple conversations, then I felt like I was losing myself here. Just being the wife. Just going through the motions. He listened in a way that felt different. Different? I echoed, my voice laced with disbelief. Do you realize what you've done? You didn't just lie to me, you tore apart everything we built together, and you thought I'd never find out. I don't know what I thought, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I thought I could keep both parts of my life separate. I never wanted to hurt you. I laughed bitterly. Separate? You were living a lie, Amelia, and you dragged me along for it. Did you even feel guilty? Or did you enjoy stringing me along, making a fool out of me? Her face crumpled and she covered her face with her hands. Please, Mike. I know I was wrong. I'm sorry. I can't lose you over this. She reached out, attempting to grab my hand, but I pulled back, her touch suddenly repulsive. Her face contorted with pain, but it was nothing compared to the tidal wave of betrayal coursing through me. I needed to get away from her, to think, to breathe. I stood up, my head spinning with everything I'd uncovered. I need some time, I said finally. I can't even look at you right now. I left the room, ignoring her pleas, ignoring her tears. I went to the guest room, locking the door behind me, feeling the weight of everything finally crash down on me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. This wasn't the end. No. Amelia would feel what it meant to betray me in the worst way possible. And with that thought, I began to plan. Over the next few days, Amelia tried everything to win back my trust. She would wait for me at the door when I got home, call me repeatedly during the day to check in and leave small notes around the house, but each attempt only intensified my resentment. The more she tried to act like the devoted wife, the more I saw her as the stranger who had broken our marriage apart. And as I endured her displays of fake affection, I began to formulate my plan. Amelia assumed I'd need time to heal and forgive, words she tossed around like they could actually reverse the damage she had done. I let her believe I was considering reconciliation, playing along with her pleas, even agreeing to try marriage counseling. I nodded, listened, and gave her glimmers of hope, all while hiding the growing contempt I felt with each passing day. Meanwhile, I did my research on Marcus. Through a few social media searches and some casual conversation with Amelia, under the pretense of understanding her feelings, I learned enough about him to start putting my revenge into motion. I found his company website, scoured his LinkedIn, even discovered a blog he ran on personal development. Marcus, it turned out, had positioned himself as a sort of life coach for professionals, with a special focus on workplace relationships. The irony was almost laughable. One evening, while Amelia was out, I sat at my computer, eyes glued to the screen as I combed through his blog posts. Marcus had published article after article on topics like building trust in relationships and professional integrity. My jaw clenched as I read his arrogant advice, knowing he had broken every principle he preached. In that moment, a new idea started to form in my mind, one that would involve both Amelia and Marcus in ways they'd never see coming. The next day, Amelia and I went to our first counseling session. She was eager, holding my hand as we walked in, as if the weight of her affair could be lifted by an hour with a therapist. I had no such illusion. I sat through the session, nodding at the counselor's questions, pretending to be willing to move forward. Amelia poured out her apologies, speaking passionately about how empty she'd felt, how Marcus had been a distraction, but never truly her choice. The counselor suggested exercises for us to rebuild trust, like sharing our phone passwords and agreeing to open conversations about difficult feelings. I agreed to it all, putting on my best impression of a forgiving husband, knowing full well that none of this was for my healing. No, I was building a bridge to my revenge. I took the counselor's advice a step further and told Amelia I wanted to be more involved in her professional life. She jumped at the idea, relieved I was willing to show interest in her work, probably thinking it meant I was warming up to her again. So, over the next few weeks, I would casually suggest joining her at industry events and social gatherings. If I had calculated correctly, Marcus would be at one of these, and I needed to meet him in person. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, Amelia was invited to a cocktail party, celebrating her company's recent merger, and Marcus was slated to be there. She seemed nervous about me coming along, but I insisted. If we're rebuilding, I want to meet everyone who's part of your life, I said, layering my words with sincerity I didn't feel. I could tell she was torn, but eventually agreed, probably thinking this was her chance to show me her life wasn't just a facade. That evening, I dressed in my sharpest suit and arrived at the event with Amelia by my side. I could feel her tense as we entered the room, scanning the crowd, probably searching for Marcus. I kept my face neutral, pretending I was here to support her, but every step I took was a step closer to the confrontation I'd been craving. Then, I spotted him. Marcus was taller than I expected, with that smug confidence I'd seen in photos. As soon as he saw us, he froze for a fraction of a second, a look of shock quickly masked by a professional smile. Amelia's hand tightened around mine as she guided us toward him, her face pale. "Marcus, this is my husband, Mike," she introduced us, her voice trembling slightly. "Mike, great to finally meet you," Marcus said, extending a hand, his expression unreadable. "Likewise," I replied, gripping his hand firmly, holding eye contact a beat longer than necessary. I could see the flicker of discomfort in his eyes, a slight waver in his polished smile. Amelia stayed close, nervously watching our exchange. I kept the conversation casual, even pleasant, as we chatted about business, life, and common interests. Marcus seemed eager to impress, probably thinking he could charm his way into my good graces. He didn't know that my plan was just beginning. Over the next hour, I subtly asked questions, learning more about his business ventures, his consulting firm, and the clients he worked with. When he excused himself to talk to someone else, I had already gathered everything I needed. Amelia looked relieved when he left, but I leaned over and whispered, "Let's stay a while. I'm enjoying myself." She forced a smile, probably confused, but nodded. I watched her as she kept looking over her shoulder, clearly worried about my next move. But I just continued to mingle, chatting with other guests, gathering details about Marcus's work and personal connections. I was playing the part of the supportive husband perfectly, all the while concealing the storm brewing inside me. As we drove home that night, I kept the conversation light, pretending to be grateful for her commitment to our relationship. But in the back of my mind, I knew that my setup was in place. Marcus and Amelia would pay for this betrayal in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. As the days passed, I kept up the act, immersing myself in Amelia's work life, and occasionally asking about Marcus as if I were still processing things. She seemed relieved, even hopeful. To her, I was coming around, choosing forgiveness. But I wasn't about to forgive or forget. I was about to ruin Marcus in a way that would impact his career, his finances, and his entire life. It was easy to find a way in. During our interactions at the party, Marcus had unwittingly revealed a few details about his consulting business, particularly a new, high-profile client he was working with, an influential tech firm that would make or break his career. I did some digging, contacting a friend who worked in the industry and confirmed that Marcus's consulting contract was indeed his big-ticket opportunity. Losing it would be a disaster for him, both professionally and financially. I reached out to the tech firm under a fake name, using a dummy email to inquire about their consultants. Then, posing as a potential client, I sent emails to their executives, mentioning Marcus's questionable ethics and hinting at improprieties without specifics. I included vague references to his extracurricular activities with clients' spouses. It didn't take much. Just enough innuendo, just enough suggestion of scandal to make them wary of trusting him. I knew the firm would take notice, especially in a field as competitive as tech consulting. Meanwhile, I kept gathering information from Amelia. She still believed we were rebuilding, and she was so focused on making things right that she didn't notice I was discreetly accessing her work email, where I discovered plenty of exchanges with Marcus. I was careful, though, never leaving evidence of my searches, ensuring my access remained invisible. In the course of this, I found more than I'd expected. Not only were they exchanging flirtatious messages, but they'd even coordinated work strategies and minor unethical practices to benefit each other's careers. With this ammunition, I moved forward. I gathered copies of their exchanges, careful not to leave any trace of my interference. Then, I set up a series of anonymous tips, using the same fake email to send the messages to the tech firm and others associated with Marcus's business. I included incriminating snippets from his exchanges with Amelia and added enough details to suggest that Marcus wasn't only professionally compromised, but untrustworthy on a personal level, too. Within a week, Marcus's world began to crumble. First, Amelia came home one evening, pale and shaken. She told me Marcus was in trouble at work. Apparently, his clients had caught wind of rumors about him and started questioning his integrity. She seemed genuinely distressed, rattling on about how he didn't deserve this, how people were just jealous of his success. I nodded along sympathetically, fighting the urge to laugh at the absurdity of it. I knew that Marcus's consulting contract would soon be terminated, as the tech firm had little tolerance for personal scandal or questionable conduct. I watched Amelia try to maintain her composure, not realizing that the man she had betrayed me with was about to lose everything. She kept looking at me, unsure, as if to gauge my reaction, and I played the part of the supportive husband to perfection. Then, a few days later, the real turning point came. One evening, Amelia came home later than usual. She looked rattled, like she'd been crying. When I asked her what was wrong, she broke down, explaining that Marcus had been let go by his major client and that he blamed her for everything. "It's a nightmare," she sobbed. "He's convinced someone found out about us and deliberately ruined him. He keeps saying it's all my fault, that I let something slip. Mike, he's furious." I could barely contain my satisfaction. "Why would he blame you?" I asked, feigning concern. "I don't know," she cried. "I've been careful, I swear, but he's paranoid, saying there's no other explanation." I placed a comforting arm around her shoulders, hiding the thrill that surged through me. "Maybe it's a misunderstanding," I said gently. "Maybe he just has too many enemies." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I could see the confusion in her eyes, the way her mind was racing as she struggled to make sense of everything unraveling around her. In the days that followed, I kept my distance emotionally, knowing that the next phase of my plan was about to unfold. Amelia seemed desperate, apologizing constantly, insisting she wanted us to work things out. I played along, telling her we needed time, that I needed to rebuild my trust. It wasn't hard to keep her distracted. Then, I began phase 2 of my revenge. I made sure Marcus would get a personal reminder of the life he had nearly destroyed. Using an anonymous number, I texted Marcus directly, crafting a message that would strike at the heart of his worst fears. I wrote, "I know everything. Hope your career is worth the betrayal. Better look over your shoulder." I imagined him reading it, his mind spinning, wondering if it was someone he knew or some anonymous enemy. I pictured his confidence cracking, his carefully crafted world of deceit coming undone. The message was cryptic, revealing nothing of my identity, but enough to keep him on edge. Days went by, and I could tell by the look on Amelia's face that things were escalating. She was stressed, constantly checking her phone. And every time Marcus's name came up, she seemed on the verge of a breakdown. Eventually, she confessed that Marcus had stopped talking to her entirely, convinced that she was the one who'd exposed him. But it wasn't enough. I wanted them both to experience the full weight of betrayal. I waited until Amelia left the house for work one day and texted her from the same anonymous number I'd used with Marcus. This time, the message read, "I know who you are and what you did. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" She came home that night, shaken and pale. I pretended not to notice her unease, watching as she nervously avoided my gaze and hurried through dinner. She looked over her shoulder constantly, and I saw her clutching her phone, as though waiting for another message. Finally, she turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mike, I think someone knows about me and Marcus. I don't know what to do." My expression was neutral as I looked at her, feigning concern. "Maybe this is the price of what you've done," I said calmly, my words landing heavily between us. She looked at me, her eyes wide, filled with fear and desperation. For the first time, she seemed to truly understand that her betrayal had set off a chain of events that couldn't be stopped. In that moment, I knew she was broken, but I wasn't finished. With Amelia and Marcus on the verge of collapse, I set the stage for the final phase of my plan. By now, the tension between them had reached a breaking point. Amelia was coming home late, barely able to look me in the eye, while Marcus, from what I'd heard through Amelia's complaints, was growing increasingly paranoid. He'd blocked her, refused her calls, and gone completely silent. She was a wreck, pacing the house and mumbling about how he was supposed to be there for her and how she'd lost everything. It was perfect timing. That night, I told Amelia we needed to talk. She looked up at me, her face weary and lined with fear, and nodded. I led her to the living room where I'd prepared everything. "Amelia," I started, watching her closely, "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what happened. And I have questions. You owe me the truth." She nodded, her face pale. "Anything, Mike. I'll tell you anything. I want to make things right." "Tell me about Marcus," I demanded, though I already knew more than I needed to. "Who is he really? And why did you let him into our lives?" She began talking, her words spilling out in a flood of regret, recounting every excuse and justification, every twisted explanation she could muster for why she had betrayed me. She cried, saying she felt lost, and that Marcus had been there for her in ways she couldn't explain, but that now she knew she'd made a terrible mistake. I listened, feeling nothing but a quiet, cold satisfaction. When she finished, wiping her tears, I held her gaze. "I want a divorce," I said, keeping my voice steady. The words hit her like a slap. She froze, staring at me, her tear-streaked face filled with disbelief. "No, Mike, please. I'll do anything. I can't lose you like this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake. But we can fix this. We can try again. We were good together once. Please." I shook my head, letting the silence stretch. Then, as if it were an afterthought, I handed her an envelope. "I think it's time you see this." She opened it with trembling hands, pulling out a stack of printed screenshots, photos of her messages with Marcus, the flirtations, the details of her meetings with him, the very evidence I had carefully gathered over the past few weeks. Her face drained of color as she flipped through them, her mouth open, a horrified gasp escaping her lips. "Mike, how did you—" Her words failed her. "I knew for months, Amelia," I said, letting my voice grow hard. "I knew what you were doing, and I wanted you to feel exactly what it's like to be betrayed." I watched as the weight of my words hit her. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. She finally understood that this wasn't about forgiveness. It was never about moving forward. I had made her live in fear, turned her betrayal into a living nightmare, just as she had done to me. When she finally found her voice, she looked broken, desperate. "Mike, please, you can't do this. We've built a life together." "That life ended when you chose to betray me," I replied coldly. I got up, leaving her slumped on the couch, and went to the bedroom. I packed a small bag, leaving behind everything I no longer wanted. I didn't need this house, these memories. I was ready to leave it all behind. But as I reached the door, I turned back to look at her one last time. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," I said, "and don't bother calling Marcus. He's lost everything, thanks to you. And now, so have you." With that, I walked out, hearing her sobs echoing down the hallway as I left. In the weeks that followed, everything fell apart for Amelia. Word spread quickly about her affair. Whispers and rumors circulated among friends and family. Even her job, the one she'd clung to throughout everything, grew tense as her coworkers began to distance themselves. She was truly alone, left to face the consequences of her actions. As for me, I found peace I hadn't felt in years. I settled into a new apartment, started focusing on my own life, leaving the past behind. Amelia occasionally reached out, trying to meet, to explain herself, but I ignored her messages. She'd lost her job shortly after Marcus was blacklisted in the industry. She had gambled everything on her lies and deceit, and now she had nothing. Looking back, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I'd taken back control of my life, and while the journey had been dark and painful, I finally had closure. For Amelia, it was only the beginning of a long, lonely road.